Okay, so let's go back up here. I was gonna make a little video for this. Maybe I'll try to make a video out of our Zoom call. I'll just edit it down. But I wanted to walk through some, just our timeline here of history in the class and just the idea of timelines in general. So gosh, probably like 3 years now, I impulsively on the first day of class was like, how many people in here have gotten the textbook? And like one person, it was an overload class. There was 80 students in it. Like 1 or 2 people raised their hands. I'm like, all right, well, that's probably good. Actually, you guys just go return those. We're not going to use a book. So we only used open source materials, and it was a little bit chaotic because normally people plan those things out in advance from the course. We just kind of did it on the fly together. So it felt like building an airplane while we're learning how to fly, while it's also up at like 50,000 feet. There's a lot riding on it. So we don't want to crash. So I've been approaching the course very differently since then, both with kind of the material, the book. We're not using a book, but so the material that we're working through and the way we're choosing to work through that material. So I'm willing to bet with everyone on here, maybe with the exception of, is it Caroline, who was in the UK. So they've got different history books and approach history differently. It's a different country. But I'm willing to bet that most people's experience of learning history is usually broken, at least when it's American history, but this is kind of true for the way we teach all history. Most everyone in here, your experience would be that learning things by themes. So you probably had, when you went over this section in high school or in junior high, 8th grade, you probably had a chapter on Reconstruction, and then maybe one chapter on the West, and maybe another chapter on industrialization, and then maybe another chapter on like robber barons and the rich and the growth of wealth inequality. Probably not. We don't like to talk about that in America. But anyways, these might have all been different chapters in your history textbook, but they're all happening at the same time. And the problem is when we break them up by chapters like that, it makes this false divide between this event happening over here and this event happening over here. And I actually think it's very confusing, and it makes it harder for all of us to see cause and effect, to be able to look at things unfolding kind of like one after another, see the dominoes all lined up. When we get that, we understand history, and it's not overwhelming or scary or boring or any of those things. But when it's kind of compartmentalized and sliced up, I feel like, well, historians like that, and they probably have a big enough framework to talk about those things in separate categories. We don't, though. The average learner, the average student does not. Here, let me see. Can you guys see my face right now or my computer screen?
We see a little girl with balloons, and we see rocks. Yeah. And we see like, hi everyone, I finally got a few videos uploaded.
Oh yeah, that's my desktop. All right, let me stop. I am talking. Okay, so you can see me now. All right. So with like textbooks being like that, I just found that they're more unhelpful than anything else to learning history. So we went back and I started just placing everything I could in just chronological order. So you'll notice the course, the stuff in OneNote and Satori in our syllabus is all kind of year by year, just going straight through it, which means that things are not as condensed always as they would be in a traditionally laid out textbook. Because, right, like Teddy Roosevelt will keep coming up over and over and over and over again for like 10 years at least, because he's doing all these different things. But as different in different positions, you know, as a different person or actor for the government. And it's over a long time period. Usually there's just a section over here on Theodore Roosevelt, like when he gets elected. It's helpful for us to see him before he gets elected to know what's going on. That's kind of true for all presidents. So in your class notes, when we're writing notes, that is where we have to get a little creative, because you don't want to have to go through pages of notes to find everything on Theodore Roosevelt, right? You want to see that information kind of at least mostly in one place when you're studying notes for a test. So when you guys are doing things and you're coming across information, and say we're like in the mid 1900s, right? Like it's 1905, 1906. Theodore Roosevelt's doing stuff. There's an election coming up. He's busting up big monopolies. And that information is important, and you'd want to include it in your notes on Theodore Roosevelt. But you might not need to put it right there in 1906. You could maybe put that up in the big header, like the first time we see Theodore Roosevelt, so that we'll see him in the 1890s and get a whole lot of information on him. And then maybe down there in 1905 or 1906, there's just a one line in there: Theodore Roosevelt breaks up this corporation or whatever. But you could know that that information is already condensed into like one space. So that's on you guys though. Like, I'm not doing that. You're writing the notes. I can help you. I can give you advice and whatnot, but you guys are writing the notes. So let me go back to the screen, and then I will walk us through kind of what we're doing, our overflow, our material here. Real quick, let me just pause and say, get feedback, because it's very hard not being in a class. So normally I get like visual feedback, you know, like you're in church and people are like, mm-hmm, amen. I don't get that on Zoom. So what I just said about history textbooks and changing the pedagogy, the way we learn history, does that make sense to you guys? Did that connect? Are you like, yeah, that is how I learned history, and it wasn't helpful? Or are you like, nah, you know, I like that. It made sense to me. We were good in history class.
Professor, it seems to me you're advocating for a narrative style approach to history, like a singular narrative where you like kind of encapsulate like phenomena within like a single story. Whereas, as you say, in textbooks, you can break it down in several pieces. Yeah. I'm a fan of both approaches personally, but I think I understand if you're talking to the average historical layman, the singular story, bedtime story approach to history is probably funner and more enjoyable on your part.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually great. No, that's really good insight. It's like it's one giant story versus a bunch of little TV episodes, right? It's like, no. And TV shows themselves are like that, where you could have a 24 episode season of a TV show and it's all generally connected, right? The characters are the main characters are the same and stuff, but each episode is kind of independent of one another. You don't have to have watched the one before to get the next one. And then there's shows where it's like, you know, Stranger Things or something like that. And you're like, no, if you hopped in at episode 7, you'd be like, what the hell's happening? You probably just shut it off. So that one is one big story that takes a lot of commitment to even watch. But when we like it, when we get it, we binge watch it. So history itself, our history, can be like that. Once we're like, oh, I've got a framework to put all this big story into, instead of just tons of information that I have to store. To me, that's better than I have little boxes that I can put this information in to help me sort it. So I can go, well, this is the Watergate box, and this is the moral majority box, and this is like the Bill Clinton box, and this is the George Bush box. And it's like, well, that might help us wrap our minds around that one little subject, but it doesn't do us a great service in terms of that bigger story. So yeah, I like the way you put that, Noah. That was good.
Of course, yeah. And one can even say that the story approach, sir, is a precursor to the compartmentalization. Because if you understand the grander narrative, you can diversify and build upon it.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And like in upper division history classes, grad school, those are the courses. But instead of having one chapter that's World War One in a big survey class, the whole class is on World War One. So you can just go, all right, this is the theme. We're just going to dive into it here. And those are great. But the reason the average person or the average student would never even want to take a course like that is usually because they don't have that underpinning, the bigger framework to put that in. Yeah. Anybody else? Any other feedback from you guys? Thoughts? Okay, so let me talk about dates then, because this is the other thing that usually freaks people out in history classes. Having to learn just like tons of dates and minutia about all these weird little details that you don't care about, and usually nobody else does either. And then if you get these dates wrong, you're bad at history. It's like, well, that's kind of just like a memorize and regurgitate approach to history. I don't care about a ton of dates. I care much more that you know the general area of where something would be, right? So I don't care that you don't know the date that Prohibition started. I don't even know that date. I mean, I think it's in January or March 1920. Knowing that it's 1920 would be great. Knowing that it was just in the early 20s is good enough for me, for the most part. I mean, when it comes to a test, the bar would be a little bit higher than that, but that's because you'll have all just studied stuff. And also because they're going to be online tests. And if you're not using, if you're online and you're not using Google and stuff like that, you're a more honest person than probably the average student. So I'm going to design the tests to be open book, open note, open forum, open internet browsers, open Alexa, because I really want to engage not so much your retention capacity for like how much crap can you shove in your head and remember, but more like, hey, how much stuff were you able to remember, and do you know what it is that you are remembering? Because it doesn't matter if you memorized all these dates about World War II. If it's just a big mysterious question mark and you're like, I don't know how Hitler killed 6 million Jews. I don't know. Maybe we had to use that. I don't know. This is just too much. So if you memorized a bunch of dates and facts about that, who cares? It's no good. I find what is helpful is to have a handful of like landmark dates. So, like a landmark, a physical landmark. We've got some in the Antelope Valley, right? I've got a few in mind. I'm curious. What do you guys think like the big landmarks are in the Antelope Valley? Like you can recognize them. You could give people directions, like, oh, it's over by this or around that or past that.
Eric?
What was that?
Eric? No, I'm joking around. I think maybe like the NASA buildings, possibly Lockheed locations.
Yeah, right. Like you don't even have to know which company it is. Well, there's a few there, right? But you can just say like the aerospace dump, and like everybody knows because it's literally in the middle of our town, our valley, like city area. It's just right there in the middle. That's a good one. That was a good one. What else?
I was gonna say Sierra Highway, like the train, the metro.
Totally, right? So the
train.
railroad tracks are, we only have one set of them.
Correct.
They run all the way through everything, and everybody knows where they are because everybody's driven over them. Yeah, that's a great one. That's excellent.
The aqueduct, maybe?
What about the Jethawk Stadium's another one?
Yeah, good. Both of those. The aqueduct, for sure. And then the Jethawks. Yeah, it's pretty visible. Definitely you see it off the freeway. People from out of town might even know like where it is. Easy to
I was gonna say Movies 22, but we don't have that no more.
Yeah. You mean
Nope,
the
it's
Titanic
enclosed.
building that sits empty now?
Yeah, exactly.
The one that's close to Staples, or that really huge one that's
Yeah.
another
Both
really
of
huge one?
them. You can see
Oh.
them off the freeway.
You know, I was thinking of another one would be the Quartz Hill water towers. Right, those.
Oh yeah, on Avenue M, right?
Yeah. We probably have a lot more, but we all live in the Antelope Valley, so all of those things, everybody in here is like, oh yeah, I know where those are. So if I told you, hey, my house lies somewhere between, the Jethawk Stadium and the Quartz Hill Water Tower, like in a straight line, you'd go, all right, that's a little vague, but I know the general area where your house is now, because you know where those landmarks are.
You look like a West Sider.
Thank you.
I'm just
We actually we moved from Pear Blossom, so we were like dirt farmers out in freaking boondocks, and then now we rent a tiny house in Quartz Hill from like the parents of some friends of ours, but we've got an acre, so we have 17 chickens and 2
Nice.
pygmy goats and a couple guinea pigs, and we'll probably get a unicorn soon, I'm sure.
chickens intimidate me.
They
How do
intimidate
they
me as
intimidate
well.
you?
My
How
They
brain
intimidate me.
How?
to the chickens.
I
have
hold a
goats.
chicken before,
The goats
especially a chick.
because we got little pygmy goats. I'm like, they're cool. I like them. They're very docile creatures.
How chickens are intimidating?
They
Well,
are.
they kind of are.
And we've got a few roosters too. They're even more.
Yes, they are intimidating to me.
Oh yeah, those. I was once scared getting close to them.
Hey, here's a weird historical fact I learned when we got goats. Goats were the first ever domesticated animal.
Which we used to.
Whoa.
That blew up loud. Somebody's.
What was that?
Sorry.
Oh yeah, I think that might have been your stuff. It was just normal and it went like into.
Dude, I am so sorry.
Well, that's okay. That
I think it's
was
just
happening to me all during last semester. Students are like, it sounds like you just start screaming. I'm like, oh, sorry. So I got a better mic and stuff now. But.
I adjust my noise now. Hold on.
Okay, so if we have landmarks, then it's easy to navigate things. It's really easy in our town too, because it was all settled and pioneered by a bunch of engineers. So it's laid out pretty well because they're very logical, methodical people. So when I can also just say, hey, go down N6 and then turn on 35th, and you're like, oh well, I know where to go. Like all the number streets go this way and all the letter streets go this way. They're all sequential and it's all in square miles. Very easy to navigate that way. I'm hoping that doing things chronologically makes our kind of street pattern for our history map like that, like easier to navigate, but then also really like nailing down some historical landmarks time-wise, because then like, oh, this was that. When you learn something new, you're like, oh, that happened before all this stuff or after it or during it. Like one of my friends, I saw them post something on I don't know, like Instagram or something. It was an A1 sauce bottle, and it says on the thing established 1861, and they're all, somebody made a steak sauce during the Civil War. And I'm like, I've thought that before too, looking at it. That's a weird thing that a history professor would probably do. But you know what's happening in the world in that time or that era at least. And that is such a valuable thing past history class. It gives us all a little bit more confidence about where we are in the world right now, right? Like we know how we got here a little bit better. We know what's been happening. Like we know why things are the way they are. And then our opinions formed kind of in light of that, we can also stand even more confidently in those. Just like, hey, this is well-founded. I really do know the background on this. So this is why I said we're going to do this in Canvas the whole time, because I'm still working on this, but and you guys can all see my screen here, right?
Yep.
OneNote. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So to the left, you'll see our weeks. You know, we got 16 weeks and the start date for that week. And then the time period we're going to look at and kind of, I'm trying to grab like the biggest themes that would be going on during that period. So yeah, it is good to start with Reconstruction. That's
Mm-hmm.
I'll have to start there. And then underneath this, if you click that, it's a hyperlink that will take you directly to the Satori board for that week. So again, I'm cleaning these up, but this is like, okay, this is what we wanted to click on. And then I've got a little introduction here. And what I shared in the Satori video is I'll be cleaning a lot of this up because this is now like 2.5 years of kind of, I made this, but I've had students add to it and edit it and join me in it for a couple years now. And I've never gone and like cleaned it up. So like the first one is this Industrial Revolution. Please, sir, we are starving. Oh, fuck, my arm. I didn't put that in there. Students did, which is, I'm not like, I'm not very prudish, so that doesn't upset me, but I'll probably just delete this because it's like, man, this is just kind of making it bigger and messier than it needs to be. But I've put in things like this, right? So
We're still seeing your syllabus.
in an age of like, particularly digital media, I'm all about getting information efficiently. So like in an infographic snapshot, boom, this is where everybody is during the Civil War. This is like where the country is. Okay, this is great. How many people died in each one of these wars, you know, how much the dollar was worth, how many people were in each one of these armies, and then the population of the North and the South. That's okay. That's not complicated information. You don't have to like remember that. I'm not going to quiz anybody like, what was the population of the South during the Civil War era? No, I don't care about that. I don't care about you retaining that. What I would care about you retaining is realizing the North is more than twice the size of the South population wise. And you can see that reflected in their armies as well.
Are we
Also, and
looking
a lot
at
of the
your-
slaves escaping as well.
Yes, but that's not on this infographic. So I'm trying to say just specifically from this infographic, because there'll be other ones like it. It's like, I don't need you to remember the specific numbers of population. I don't need you to remember what the dollar was worth in that time. I would want you to look at this, read through it, and like, just think about it before you move on to the next thing and just go, okay, well, what is this? This thing's here for a reason. What is it telling me? It's really trying to point out that the North was way bigger and they were richer than the South.
Mhm.
South had a lot of rich people, they had a lot of money, but it was really concentrated in the hands of just a few. And then after the North did a naval blockade of the South, they kind of cut them off economically. Like that's how they were winning the war.
And they also attacked slave plantations. So they just lost their major source of, like they started burning them and they started,
Right,
like,
Correct.
Yeah.
right.
they had no railroad, so they couldn't even transport their troops or anything like that. And they
Yeah.
didn't have a central
Yeah.
government. Yeah.
This is a weird thing that I didn't even really learn or kind of figure out until I started teaching history. The Emancipation Proclamation is not, it's not like in the Constitution, right? How does the president just declare the slaves free? Well, he did it as an act of war,
Mhm.
because in war, it's okay to, take or even destroy contraband, which normally is like, oh, we found weapons or food or horses or, well, in the South's case, their contraband was slaves because they were working and making money for the South. So therefore they're part of this economy. So he said, hey, wherever wherever we go, wherever the North goes, all slaves are free. But in the states that didn't secede from the Union, like Kentucky or Maryland, they had slavery in
Louisiana.
those states, but they didn't secede from the Union. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to slaves living in the North. Now that's just interesting. I found that interesting. I
Correct.
would not expect you to get that from the infographic I showed you. I wouldn't expect you to even come to the conclusion that, economically choking the South was kind of one of the ways the North won. All I'd want you to get from that infographic is that, the North is a lot bigger than the South and seems to just have more, power. Because they did, and that's really significant. Just to know, we would want to know that because, did you know the South was a lot smaller than the North? Right? Like, I didn't even learn that in history classes in college. We didn't talk about that for some reason until I got to a certain point. We did, but like earlier on survey ones, we didn't learn those things. So let me go back to screen sharing here. I'll go back to not Satori, but we'll go back into the syllabus here. So, so here's the week, and then this link to that is the material you guys are going to work through each week. And so it's mostly videos, it's audio, it's links to some websites you can go poke around on. It's not a lot of reading text at all. So, especially because it's like that, I'm really asking you guys to watch the videos. There are ones that are in there for like supplemental or fun. I talked about this on the Satori video, but so you'll know which ones that you don't have to watch all the way. But the main ones, like, watch them. This is our text for the class. Like, that is the information. And if you're like, man, but I just do better reading things, then you take notes, really detailed notes while you're listening to it. You could try transcribing what you're listening to or watching. You can also put the captions on and read while you're watching it. And, if you're writing it down, you'll remember it more. Anybody would. It's just physical memory reinforces it. So, okay. So, that's where you'll find the work, the subject work. And then over here, I'm working on making this let's just, for right now, we'll say landmarks. There we go. Change the font. So what I'm putting over here is things that important moments or dates that are good to know as like historical landmarks, so you can place things within them. So we're not going to spend tons of time on wars in terms of like the military history of it. That's fascinating, and there's a place for that. We'll spend a lot of time on the wars in terms of like the causes of the wars and the like life during the war on the home front, and then the effects of the war kind of at home and abroad. So we'll do that with all the wars. We're not going to get into like tons of too much detailed military history, but we will spend a lot of time talking about war. So knowing when these wars are is very, very helpful for being able to like categorize things before, after, or during those times. So knowing that the Civil War starts in 1860 and ends in 1865, just knowing, okay, it starts then. Well, it really starts in 1861, but it starts when
I was going to say that.
yeah, it starts in 1861, but it starts at the end of 1860 when Abraham Lincoln gets elected. Like South Carolina had said, if he gets elected, we're leaving. And he got elected, but the inauguration isn't until March. So you know, 1860 or 61, but 1865 is when it ends. And that's the thing about wars. Sometimes it's kind of hard to nail down when they begin, as we'll see with World War II. But it's easy to know when they end, because there's pretty much always a victor, even when we say we're going to go off to have war without victory. So knowing that, and this is easy for you now because our class begins in 1865. It's in the course description. So when does the
Great.
class start? 1865. All right, it starts when the Civil War ends. Okay, so everybody's got that. You're locked in. That's our baseline starting point. And then this corrupt bargain you'll get into in this first week. It's the end of Reconstruction. That happens in that election year, and then the inauguration of the next president, Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican. So the Democrats basically made a deal to get rid of the army in the South and get rid of the pesky Northerners that took all their government jobs away from them, so that they wouldn't contest the election, which the Democrats probably actually would have won. They did win the popular election. So that's like the first week. That is when a lot of history textbooks are broken up. Those are the two dates for now. I might add a second or third in there. And I will definitely be adding one or two more into this second week here, industrialization and the West. So this is after the Transcontinental Railroad's completed, and kind of what Thomas Jefferson said would take 500 years after the survey of Lewis and Clark to reach and colonize the West Coast. We did by the end of the decade. Before even the end of the decade, to where in 1890, the U.S. Census Department declares the West, the frontier, closed. Like there's no more frontier. There's no more Wild West. Everything's organized territories or states. There are no more Indian tribes that are waging war on anybody anywhere. We've killed all of them by 1890. And so you'll see the Wounded Knee Massacre in there at 1890 is an utterly tragic event. And it's one that we definitely try to downplay and gloss over in American history because, well, everybody but, you know, Native Americans are wanting to forget that story because it's uncomfortable. The way
Very uncomfortable.
the way the Holocaust is uncomfortable, the way, you know,
Slavery is uncomfortable.
the way slavery is exactly, like it's like, well, we don't want to talk about that, but that is a marker for, you know, all kinds of reasons. But between that being this tragedy and then it also being the same year that the Census Bureau declares the Western frontier closed, definitely marks a turning of the page. In fact, a very famous historian named Frederick Jackson Turner will write a book in 1893, a few years later, on this, and it's called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. It's like, well, this is part of our psyche. This is part of our makeup. Since there's been Europeans in America, at least, there's been a frontier for them going east to west. 1877 to 1890 is kind of like, well, we'll be looking at things in that period there. And the thing that, you know, in that, what I might add in there is the workings of Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. So it's like, okay, well, it's the pioneering of electrical engineering, the beginning of kind of the electric age. And then real quickly, we get the phonograph and the cinescope, which is the like movie camera projector, like all within just a really short period of time. So this is very innovative time. And then 1890 to 1900 is America changes dramatically. more big money comes into government. There's a massive, the worst depression that the country had ever had until the Great
2008.
Depression of 1907. And that was the worst. And then they had the Great Depression of 1929. That was the worst. That was the Great Depression. So in 1893, there's this big depression, national event. And then in 1898, we go to war with Spain for really no good reason, and just to take their colonial properties, because not just because America is aggressive and wanted to expand frontiers, but because everybody else was doing that. Like, and that's the thing about global context that's important. Everybody else was doing that. So all of the, European countries are carving up Africa and Asia and the Pacific left and right, and America comes in very late to the game, but enters it strongly. So by the turn of the century there, I'll just come back to the screen for a second while I talk. By the turn of the century, America has become the industrial power of the world. In 1865, America was like a large country, a growing country, prosperous country, but like all the big countries in Europe, they didn't really care. They didn't care that much about what was going on in America. And it was definitely second rate. I mean, it was very underdeveloped and, by European standards. So America is like written off as kind of a, ugly stepkid of the European colonial powers. But in the time between the end of the Civil War, 1865, and the turn of the century in 1900, our industrial output, like, it quadruples and quadruples and quadruples. So by that time, we are the biggest producer of steel. We have the most railroad out of anybody laid. We've got, we're the most oil producing country in the world. Like all these things, it's America just kind of leapfrogs. And now we've got an overseas empire in the Philippines, Guam and Puerto Rico. And geez, okay, America just changed in that 35-year window from the close of the war to the end of the century. America transforms dramatically. And so does immigration. Talk about that. And worldwide, it's a very exciting time. The 1900 World Fair in Paris is this epic kind of event. It's when Campbell's Soup gets their little golden medal on their soup can. And America makes a very big showing there. Thomas Edison is like a superstar. So it's a moment to kind of go and stop and pause, because right after that, things change dramatically. The Wright brothers learn how to fly. The Model T goes into production. The Titanic sinks. Panama Canal is built. Okay, so 14 years, a lot of stuff has happened. Oh, I forgot. I need to add on there, Marconi began doing radio transmissions. So there's a lot of in terms of our history, human history, those are really big things to remember. And the Titanic isn't a particularly important event to remember, but I've found it's one that everybody knows and kind of cares about, and most people have at least seen that movie. So they're like, okay, so I can imagine 1912 in my mind at least, or thereabouts, right around there, before World War I. So yeah, leading up to World War I, there's a massive technological change. I mean, just new weapons, new technology, new communications. And there is this colonial scramble where all of a sudden the industrial countries are fighting not to go get land the way colonialization happened when America was colonized. where they're going for God, gold, and glory, right? It's like, well, the missionaries are going to, no, this was like, hey, we need to get into countries to extract their natural resources and bring them back for industrial production. And, you know, oil becomes really significant, but even before that, like rubber trees, you know, that like these kinds of resources become super important. So the world's getting carved up between Europe, all the European powers, America, and Japan, actually. And it's arming up as well. So there's this like tense ramp up to World War I, and then everybody's kind of caught off guard when the world goes to war and everybody starts killing themselves. But to the astute observer, you know, that this is like, oh, you could have seen this coming. If you're looking at like what's going on in the world before this, we'll see like, God, like almost anything could have set that off because everything was so tense. I mean, you know, we feel that right now in our culture, right? Like, dude, things are tense right now. Like, it's not going to take a lot to set it off. Like, we're a lot closer to that than we were 10 years ago. Even more so by 1914. And so then we'll get into the Great War, the war, the craziest war. Like, it's so crazy. Nothing like this has ever happened. And so this is really important for us to know, because this isn't even important for an American history class. Like, the world, this is an important world date for everyone, 1914 to 1918. So on this, I wouldn't expect you to have to know that the Titanic sank in 1912. But I do think I'd want you to know the Wright brothers in 1903. Like, that's good to know. Okay, that's right at the beginning of the century. All right, people are just learning how to fly. We're just getting cars. All right, I know where we are now. And then after 1920, the war ends in 1918. Takes a little while to wrap up. We go on to the 1920s, and this is so Prohibition starts in 1920, as does the, I think it's the 20th Amendment, right?
Prohibition's the 20th Amendment, sir, and universal suffrage is the 19th, I believe.
Yeah, so like, I always flip-flop those two. Let me take my cap locks off. Let's see. There we go. So those both happen in 1920, or are like ratified in 1920. So knowing that, like, okay, well, both of those are significant. I mean, women getting the right to vote, you know.
Can we talk about are we talking about the Harlem Renaissance as well?
Yes, absolutely. So that's like a beautiful part of the 1920s. The 1920s is so weird, but I love the Harlem Renaissance. It's so good. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we'll talk about like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay and the Cotton Club and jazz. Oh my God, I love talking about the history of music. So that's you know, the 1920s are really fun that way. It's awful, but it's also where the mob begins, which is, correct. You know, yes. We like looking at the mob. Americans love gangster movies, right?
In Chicago and New York.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's the jazz era. It's the silent movie era. It's fun. It's really fun that way. There's no world war going on. But, you know, when we do look at the Harlem Renaissance, we can also look at like, oh, well, shit, lynchings went up a whole bunch in the South, and the KKK is on friggin' Ferris wheels, like at carnivals out in public in the day with their hoods on. Well, maybe those weren't the good old days for everybody.
Right. Well, not in South, correct.
And that right there is why it's so important for us to have a bigger context for things, because it's like, all right, those were not the good old days for everybody.
No.
And, you know, even like let's go way earlier than that. We'll go before, outside of America. Let's go back to, like, you know, Jane Austen era, right? Sense and Sensibility. That'd be great, right? No.
Mhm.
You know why in all those movies the women are walking around with those little potpourris? And it's because everything smelled like shit all the time.
Yeah.
Everywhere. Okay, like,
Yeah.
we don't want to go back there. They weren't.
Yeah.
Those weren't the good old days for anybody. We don't want to go back.
No.
But yeah, when we're talking about make America great, or, you know, the olden days, or the good, you know, the golden 50s, it's like, well, we're talking about one specific, you know, group. That
Right.
prerogative
Group.
for one person. In fact, let me pull up a clip. I'm gonna try this. This is you know, all our you guys are my guinea pigs here. So let's go to YouTube. Some of you guys have probably seen this this clip. It came out maybe 7 years ago, 8 years ago.
Move on to the next question. Go ahead.
Hi.
We're done with that. All right. So I pulled that up for a reason. I got some things I'll say. But just anybody want to respond to that, or thoughts on that clip?
Sir, Professor, I read a lot of history, and inevitably I began to read a lot of the philosophy surrounding it, not just within history, but how we write history. And like I like reading the works of Nietzsche on the genealogy of morals, like how history is constructed to like as a narrative for society to understand itself. Or like I think I'm not trying to make a political statement, but I do think that narratives are re-engineered every generation. So I think that when people engage in political dialogue, especially if they're like a similar affiliation, like a similar nationality, for example, what they're doing is catalyzing something that is ideal. So I think like I've read the works of Edward Edinger, a psychologist, like a psychoanalyst, and he says that the initial American narrative was Europeans fleeing religious oppression and economic like bad times in Europe. Yeah. And so when they got here, they set up representative democracy, and they set up they set up capitalist institutions. I'm using a neutral term that allow people to trade, and that has a broad appeal, especially if you're European. There may be tensions, but that has a broad appeal. And I think each generation you rebuild upon and manipulate that. Like I imagine in the 19th century, the narrative, the big topic was slavery, and like we had to talk to ourselves: is that something we want to have? And during the Second World War, we were talking about our role in the international community. Like, should we be isolationists or should we go to war? Yeah. In the 1960s, it was civil rights. No, you see, so you go through paradigm shifts. So I think that the psychological narrative is like one of encountering like a frontier, like you said, like something like a challenge, and that every generation that's rediscovered, so to speak. At least that's my psychological analysis.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. I think you're right. Right on the money. We tell history to make sense of what's going on. Without it, that's crazy chaos, right? If you don't know, if there's nothing back there, but there also, it's always influenced by, well, our own internal biases, but also the external pressures from like, well, who pays for the textbooks, right? For public education. Government, the Department of Education, the federal government, right? So you can't write a history book that's too honest about America's shortcomings, or it will not go into schools. so there's all kinds of like influences, and then those cultural moments like you were talking about, right? Like slavery in this one moment, like economic or religious suppression in this other moment. It's interesting because when I played that 8 years ago, a few things. So it was kind of shocking for students to hear Jeff Daniels to say like America's not the greatest nation in the world. Like they were kind of like, I don't think anybody's shocked by that anymore. I don't think that's a thing where people are like, wait, what? Like, we're not having that conversation anymore. That narrative's changed for America, but also that there was probably a greater draw even to that kind of patriotic speech that Jeff Daniels gives. So the Newsroom, it's a great show. I think it's 3 or 4 seasons, really good acting, great show. It's by Aaron Sorkin. I don't know if you know him. He's a big like director, producer who did, he's done quite a few shows. He did The West Wing, which is a great show. It's like late 90s, early 2000s about the presidency. He just, all of his stuff's very fast talking. It's all kind of paced like that. And they were like, yeah, that's true. We should do that and be great again. And I pointed out, okay, so what is, that was all vague language though. Like, what is great? What does that mean to you? Like, what are we going to
Yeah, great for who?
Yeah. Yeah. Like,
Great for who?
did you notice that he said men like 3 or 4 or 5 times, right? When we used to be informed by great men, revered men, men who did great things. It's like, well, shit, this sounds like the liberal version of Make America Great Again. Like, this is not anti-patriotism or nationalistic patriotism. This is just kind of like an FDR version of it, like a Franklin Roosevelt version of Make America Great Again. So instead of going back to the 80s with Reagan or the 50s with Eisenhower, it's like, well, let's go back to the 60s with Johnson or the 30s with Franklin Roosevelt, back when America was great again. Yeah, so that kind of, and that nostalgia, right? Especially when we really paint a picture, it has such a huge draw on us, and it really, really shapes how we think about history and the world. So last semester, at the very beginning of the semester, I wasn't a part of it. We just got to go. Several teachers put on a flex event at the college on like a Friday night on Gone with the Wind. So I gave people extra credit for that, and it was great. We talked about it. So I may do an extra credit opportunity where we all like do a watch party and watch Gone with the Wind and then talk about it afterwards. But that is a commitment because it's a 3-hour movie. Who has seen Gone with the Wind?
Barely. Can we do like Shawshank or something? Green Mile or something?
Well, okay, so here's the deal though. Gone with the Wind is, until Star Wars, it was the most grossing film of all time until Star Wars. And it was made in 1939. So that's like,
Correct.
that's like 40 years. That's a lot.
As the first black actress to win the Oscar.
Win an Oscar.
I think she has my last name, McDonald.
Yeah. Oh yeah. She's she's great. Yeah. So there's all these firsts, and it was also a best-selling book, and the book is longer than the movie. I mean, it's like Les Mis long. The book is longer than the Bible. It's more words than the Bible, like legit. I got like a third of the way through and kind of gave up, but I think I got the point. It was a lot more racist. Like, they definitely used the N-word in the book, and we're like, no, we can't use that in the movie. And it, this being the biggest, most grossing film of the time, won all these Oscars, huge stuff. This is like what most people think of when they think of the Civil War. I don't know that that's true for like, Gen Xers and down, but definitely for baby boomers and before, their parents and their grandparents. This is how people saw the war. And this is revisionist history. That's what that's like a very buzzy word right now. Malcolm Gladwell has a podcast called Revisionist History. It's a theme for us that we'll kind of follow throughout the course because, well, like you were saying, Noah, this is, we want to revise the past to fit our current narrative. So we can go tinker with it or cut stuff out or, make it look a certain way. So sure, this, Gone with the Wind, and realizing that most people haven't seen it, I'll just say that it's beautiful. The colors, the sets. I mean, it was like the largest film production ever done at the time. It's epic. And B, the storytelling, like from just a film narrative thing, is it's like sets the standard. But on the other side, C, there is very few Black people in the whole entire movie, and the ones that are play into the role of
that time. That reflected of
yeah,
that
like
time.
and not of that time as in slavery in 1865 when the war breaks out. That
Right.
time in 1939, like
As the help, basically.
right, and that's after like, okay, now at this point, that's after decades of the Daughters of the Confederacy going around and building Confederate monuments all over the place and raising funds so they can control what is in history textbooks for public schools, not just in the South either. Like they're a very large organization. And then also after, a movie like The Birth of a Nation comes out, which is in 1915 and is about, it's like an epic movie at the time. It won a bunch of accolades and was a huge success. I mean, like everybody had seen it. Birth of a Nation. The KKK are the heroes. It's a vigilante movie. They're essentially like the X-Men. It's like, hey, they're outside the law, but they're doing the real good. Look at all these bad Northerners and, freed slaves. This is the real problem. So these movies, these books, this is like decades now of where everybody's really far removed from the Civil War. There's very few people alive at that time who were alive during the Civil War when Gone with the Wind comes out. So everybody just has this nostalgic view of the past that Gone with the Wind comes and serves you on a beautiful Technicolor platter that you're like, well, okay, this is good. And I don't have to think about slavery or racism and, bigotry and violence against people and rape. And none of that's in the movie. Kind of like how Southerners describe themselves and how life was on the plantation. But when Northerners describe what they see, they're like, oh no, that's not what's going on. Oh, those folks are not singing because they're happy. They're not out in the field singing spirituals because they're happy. Like Harriet Beecher Stowe writes a book that changes everything because people's eyes are open. And that happens not even just with racial things. That'll happen quite a few times where these kind of expose books will just change the way people think and make us deal with stuff that, we just don't want to deal with, right?
Very uncomfortable.
Very, very uncomfortable. And
and too, it's like some people just don't want to like acknowledge maybe what people from their family have done, acknowledge like the truth. Like they said, truth hurts.
Yeah, and in a society that's hyper individualized, right? Americans are individuals. Like rugged individualism is like a part of the description of an American.
Correct.
Going like, well, I definitely haven't owned slaves, and I don't think anybody in my family did either. But like owning the collective guilt of that is hard for white Americans, especially, right? because of individualism. Like, well, not just because of that, but I think that's one of the big reasons actually is like, well, that's not my problem. I'm not those people. That was back then. That's not me. That wasn't my family. It's like, you live here, don't you?
Correct.
Has your skin color reflected that economic benefits or detractors you might have experienced in your life? Like, have you engaged in a culture where all of that is part of our history? It's like, I was thinking about this because you're exactly right. We want to forget about it, especially once we do things like pass a Civil Rights Act, right? It's like, no, we're done with that. We did the racism thing. We're done. We got it. We're good. Okay, damn, there's riots. Oh, those cops are full on beating that guy.
Right.
Oh, that's on TV now. Okay, well, we got a black president now. No, we're good. It's good. It's over. It's over. We have conquered racism. We have a black president. Yes, those happened. Thank God for the Civil Rights Act. It's beautiful. We've had a black president. We still have trauma in our past, just like a person, right? It's like, well, you can get healing. You could get healed all the way. You can go on and be not just a survivor, but a liberator, a conqueror. You can, move on. But it doesn't mean that like the trauma that you experienced in your past is not there or not part of who you are.
Well, and there's still a group of people who still perpetuate those wrongful acts. It's generational. It's like generational passed down from great, and people don't realize that, oh, my teacher, my police officer, my judge, my med doctor even can have those, where I'm trying to get to, all those type of views, those views that are not, that's not healing. They have not healed a group of people. Yeah.
It's, I can relate to that because just even on stuff like the Holocaust, it's like, well, I really don't want to talk about this. I'd much rather just talk about like cool tanks that that everyone is making. That's fun. People, like that's not controversial, but I cannot do that. Like I would do that, but I can't. I think I've learned too much, but also, I was backpacking when I had graduated college, and I went to Auschwitz, and like going to a concentration camp, you're like, well, you cannot forget, like, like being at a place, there's nothing like that. And it's kind of like becomes a part of who you are because you went there and that's an experience that you had there that you can't, reason away or ration away. You're like, no, well, I went there. That's a real place. That shit happened. Like that's right. You can't forget it. And I think when we're out of the South, it's easier for folks to think that way and live that way. But when you're, I don't know, I mean,
it's there every day in your face, Confederate flags, mock people.
Yeah.
And it's not just with, African Americans, it's other people from other minorities as well who face that same type of prejudice when they are in a certain part of America.
Yeah.
Even in the Antelope Valley or even certain parts of California.
Okay. I
definitely agree.
I've been looking for it. I'm going to have to send out an email to my class. Over intercession, I taught a History 107 class, and I was talking about how active the Klan still is, but how I had a pastor friend of mine arguing with me on Facebook that they're not that big and it's so small. And I'm like,
I have that same type of friend as well.
Yeah. I'm like, I've lived in the Antelope Valley my whole life. But there are all kinds of racists out. We've got many varieties. We've got the skinheads. We got the neo-Nazis. We got the sharps. We got the Nazi lowriders. It's like, dude, there's a lot of them out here. But while I'm talking about this, the student's like, oh man, I saw a Klan meeting. And I'm like, what? Because he's like, he's a Latino. And I'm like, dude, how? And he's like, we're in the woods. And I'm like, out here. And he's like, well, I live in Tehachapi. And after school, like when he was in high school, he's like, we went up and we're like up on the ridge. And then I look down and we look down and there's like 5 or 6 dudes in like white hoods, like in a circle. And I'm like, how could you see them? He's like, oh, it was like 4 or 5 in the afternoon. Like it was like, we could see them. They were in the middle of nowhere. I'm like, oh my God, I wish you could have taken some footage. And he's like, oh, I did. And I'm like, what? So he pulls it up and shows it to me, and he had shared it with me, but I can't find where it is. And I'm like, oh my, I need to find this, because that was like, last year in the Antelope Valley. I mean, granted, it's the hills, but well, that's usually where them peoples live. So yeah, it's uncomfortable for all kinds of reasons. Who in here has been to the South?
What do you mean by the
I
South?
grew up in the South.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
Stephanie?
So what do you mean by that?
The South, like south of the Mason-Dixon line. So Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky,
Texas, Arkansas,
Yeah, Mississippi.
South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama.
Oh, never mind.
Alabama.
5?
1, 2,
Hold on.
3, 4.
There you
Okay.
Georgia.
I kind of wish.
Yeah, well, and
Oh, and sorry if you hear dogs barking. If you hear like barking, it's just my dogs are up here.
oh, okay. Just remute yourself when you're done talking. It's cool.
Yes.
Um,
Okay.
When DC's in the South, it's not in the deep South, but it's South enough.
Mhm.
I was out there a couple years ago for a conference, and I think I was in Alexandria, and I went to like a coffee shop one morning to just get a cup of coffee while I was walking to the conference, and there's 4 people at a table behind me, just sitting, drinking coffee, talking. It's like a group of friends. You could tell they do it every Saturday morning. And they're not really old. They're like maybe like late 40s, early 50s. But they're like, oh man, things would have been different if that goddamn bastard Lincoln just never would have gotten elected. And I'm like, dude, you were not alive back then. What the hell, man? Like that was 150 years ago. Let it go. I think it's the town of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Grant conquered the city on the 4th of July. And so the town has had a moratorium on 4th of July celebrations until like 2 or 3 years ago. 150 years. They're like, nope, no fireworks. We don't do that. We don't have that kind of memory out here in California. We have a building that's like more than a decade old. We're like, rip it down. We got to get rid of that. Got to get rid of it. It's old. Like, and just LA in general, really like city-wise as a big city, it's like 100 years old now. Slavery's like 400 years old now. So I find that out here on the West, it's different than, how people interpret and look at history in places that are kind of rooted deeply. Christina, you could maybe relate to that being in England. It's like, well, there's like a lot deeper roots there for folks than there are in California.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely, like where I'm from, like I said earlier, it's very rural and the community tend to be a lot older. People are a little bit more reserved with their views, but you still hear a lot of things that kind of are shocking, especially from older people, because their views haven't changed.
Oh yeah.
They haven't, it's not the same as the South here, but it's its own beast, in a different location.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of weird, like, regional tensions even with different people, right?
Yeah.
I remember I was in Cornwall, like down in the way south, and they hated one group of people. I can't remember what it was. They really didn't like the Welsh.
Probably the Welsh.
Yeah, it was the Welsh. I was thinking it was the Welsh.
The Welsh don't like the English, and
yeah, he was going off in a pub, and he's I'm like, dang, dude, I didn't even know Cornish people were a thing until I got here. Like, I didn't even know that was a people group, but they are a people group, and they hate that other people group
Yeah.
for all kinds of historic reasons that we usually don't know why, actually, right? Like when you press the average person,
They
you
probably
press-
fought over something years ago and
Yeah.
never resolved it.
yeah, and it's like, well, dude, let's move on. Let's move on. But
That's something that's been taught too.
yeah,
It's
definitely.
taught. Don't even know why you don't even like that group of people. It's just because you grew up your whole life and your grandpa or your whoever was talking about it, and you're just like, you formed your opinion about a group of people or a particular, even like a female or a sex, just because of that experience of who was raising you.
Yeah. And think, if we think historically and go, okay, for people 10,000 years ago, right? If you run into another people group, there's a really good chance that they're going to try to kill you. Like,
Correct. Like the
Or
natives.
even accidentally
right?
with smallpox.
Yeah. They could just kill you accidentally. And if you go back just a few thousand years more than that, well, 10,000 years, 11,000 years, 12,000 years, there's literally groups of Neanderthals around. So, when you're like, hey, don't marry them, those people are different from us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they are not a lot. And we got a lot of, Europeans especially have a lot of Neanderthal DNA. I think I have like 1.5 or 2%. I got on my ancestry.com thing. But those things are just part of humans' collective history and memory. Even if you don't remember that directly, the people before us and before them, communications were not as readily available, right? Safe means of like even doing business and stuff. There is something to be said about civilization. We're probably ripping ourselves to shreds, but at the same time, we're not doing that as much tribally and locally. Well, not yet, at least. That might be coming. Yeah. So when you go up to, even where our course starts, like I said, immigration changes a lot. So all of a sudden, it's not like the English and the Swedish and the Dutch and, those folks. And then the Africans, right? Like those are the groups of people with
And the Irish.
kind of getting just pushed and pushed and pushed further. Now, all of a sudden, it's like, oh, you got all these like Germans and Irish people. And for us, hey, white guy, right? I don't really like, there's not a big difference to me, German, Irish. I don't like, dude, those people.
To them, it's a big difference.
Yeah. And they hated everybody. So when you read old descriptions and people are like, oh, this African slave came in barbaric and strange. And you're like, damn, that is straight up racism. You're like, that same guy later in the journal writes like, this foreign pig, Scottish, damn. You're like, oh, that's even worse. Oh, people kind of were afraid of everybody and hated everybody and thought everybody else that was different than them was really weird, and they didn't have diversity. Like, you didn't have encyclopedias. You couldn't even go read about what was going on in the rest of the world. In fact, you couldn't even read a few hundred years ago. By the time America's forming, America's the most literate country in the world, at least in the North, thanks to all the like religious learning that had come up into the Northeast there. So people can start to read history that's written, but there's still really not a lot of history written. We know vastly more now than we did 10 years ago, just because of the internet and archives, and just boy, we know so much more than we did. I have an old book that's like a World Encyclopedia of History I found at a thrift store. It's like, it's, I don't know, maybe it's like 800 or 900 pages. I just kind of slowly flowed through it. And it's published by Harvard, and it was published in 19 1947, I think, right after World War II. And it's very Eurocentric and very opinionated. Like it's like, oh, this guy was chivalrous here and did these fantastic things, and this dubious fellow over here. And it's like, this is a lot of commentary on historic figures. Why don't we just learn about them and judge for ourselves, right? And thus try to free ourselves from the narratives that we're all preloaded with, every one of us, right? And just go, okay, we're going to suspend that and just look at evidence, Sherlock Holmes style. We're just going to look at, so yeah, we'll watch YouTube videos on subjects, but then we'll also watch, YouTube videos of old original very first movies from Thomas Edison. Like, let's just get in. We'll read some of the original documents because we can very easily now, thanks to the internet. So,
Hey, Professor.
yeah.
I've been researching. I researched a lot of psychology, particularly as it relates to stories and how it literally catalyzes how we perceive the world. And I've been reading a lot about the Cold War and how art influenced it. Like, and I could go on for hours about it, but the most significant thing I wanted to point out was how the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, it really it tore like a gash into Soviet propaganda, because they were running around saying we're going to spread utopia, but Solzhenitsyn said, no, it's not utopia. Trust me, I've been there.
Yeah.
So that along with the Berlin Wall and like how capitalism was doing well, like, fairly well. It kind of made the Soviet Union not irrelevant, but kind of eroded it even in the eyes of its own people. They're saying like, oh my God, this is not utopia. This is just, we traded off a monarchy for another form of, monarchy. Yeah.
Yeah. So Solzhenitsyn is, for those of you guys that don't know, is like a Russian dissident. He was imprisoned in one of these gulags out in Siberia for like 13, 14 years. So it was like a long time, I think.
Too long.
And he wrote notes all the time in there and was like keeping them or storing them, hiding them, and smuggled them out when he got out and, jettisoned to America, and then published this massive Gulag Archipelago it's a very hard read in that it's not sequential and it's a little stream of consciousness, but it's horrifying because it's a life into what those camps are like. And that combined with like kind of what's come out about, Stalin, murdered, God, like 20 million people.
Specifically starved like 6 million Ukrainians in the 20s, I think, too. Like he was in a group of tyrants. Stalin's the tyrant that all tyrants are scared of, basically.
Yeah. And so you're right. Like, the Cold War ends, and really like the picture that emerges is one that's more America appears the victor. And we are the victor of the Cold War, right?
Because we're the last one standing.
But the means by which we win that Cold War are left out of the history books. Like straight up left out. Like, oh, the CIA assassinated these people, these heads of state. Okay. Oh, hey, the FBI planted evidence on this stuff. Oh, they funded secret groups to be on universities to stop liberal people. Like, oh, that's how America won the Cold War. Oh, also in making the nuclear bomb first and bombing people. And, we don't want to talk about that. We just want to talk about how capitalism works and why we're like morally good, and the proof's in the pudding that we won the war. We beat Hitler.
It was really,
what's that?
It was really surprising. Oh, I'm sorry. It was really, a bit. And also it was really surprising when I was reading like in middle school, because I really like reading about history and economics. I was really surprising how like the Truman Doctrine in the 40s was based on let's contain communist aggression and support our allies. Yeah. By the 80s, there was that giant shift towards we need to push in and kick them out. And so like we had this push in Latin America and like Nicaragua. And we like even in Chile, we had a military coup, how we literally ousted like we instituted Pinochet. Yeah, and
Yeah.
he was a dictator. He was a capitalist, but he was a yeah. So like it's like wow, we basically ensued military juntas that were pro America, basically.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Oh, you're right, man. I'm glad you know that. Very, very few do. But there's been, some movies and even a few TV shows that have come out about some of those things, and those are always great because they popularize good history that we should learn. Okay, I'll finish up this little timeline here, and then I'll just post this little poll, and we'll call it a night. Yeah, once the war ends, the Cold War begins immediately. It's like hopping right back into the next thing. So by the time we hit 1950, this kind of stalemate in Korea gets turned into a hot war that is funded by big superpowers who are not fighting directly, but via proxy. So America's funding this war through the UN, and China and Russia are funding this war through North Korea. So this Cold War escalates. It ends in a stalemate. It's the first loss for America. It's very different than World War II, and it's not that shortly after it. And I put this up here to 1954 because this is a significant year for us. So the Korean War goes for here. And then in 54, the Supreme Court decides on Brown versus Board of Education. So this marks a turning point in the civil rights movement. This is like what the NAACP had been working towards for decades. We'll get down here to the 50s, where we'll see lots of civil rights activity. And then in 1962, this is the year the Cuban Missile Crisis was. So this is like one of those epic stalemate moments. America, we're on the verge of like nuclear Armageddon basically for 13 days. So for us, we don't remember that a lot or talk about that. But for people that lived through that, it was crazy. Like it was bananas. Like people started building bomb shelters everywhere. Like backlogged for months. So, and then JFK's assassination in 1960.
My mom was telling me that she remembers, and because she, went to elementary school in Los Angeles, and she was born in the 50s, but she remembers in school how they used to practice the drills for
Duck and
the
cover.
crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man.
My dad too. They said they remember like actively, like how we used to practice for the earthquake.
Yep.
They did it for that crisis.
Yeah, my mom did that too. It was not. That's crazy. Can you imagine growing up in that? I mean, we didn't do that in school. I still grew up with like the anxiety of knowing there's nuclear weapons, but when mandated to do that in elementary school, like it's gonna mess you up. Like that's not peaceful. That's so disturbing on so many levels. But it's making 5 and 6 year olds have existential crises. Like, wait, what? We can all be annihilated in the blink of an eye? Okay, let's get under our desks. We're in Crazyville. After 1945, really after 1914, but once the bomb drops, we're in like a totally alternate reality than people that lived before this. We understand the world fundamentally different now. This time period between 1954 and 1963 is hopeful, right? There's all these student movements there. Brown v. Board of Education launches these like freedom rides and mandates to desegregate everywhere. And JFK getting elected, super like hopeful. He's this super young president out of the regular mold of kind of political cronies that get elected president. And then he gets assassinated, and we'll talk about it because it's just one of the weirdest, most bizarre moments in history. And then the time between 1963 and 1964, this is like hippie time when it's like, no more the hippies. It was here. So like 63 is things start getting radical. The president has been shot. People are just, student movements are happening, riots are happening, protests are happening, clashes with the police are happening, and it's ramping up, all mixed with like, LSD spreading everywhere and Woodstock happening in 1969. And, before that so this is like cultural, festival, basically the whole decade. But things really sour in 1968. So I'd say there's still a good deal of optimism until 1968, but then Robert Kennedy's shot, his younger brother, who was probably going to become president in the fall, and Martin Luther King gets shot. So this is like, oh no. The next year's Woodstock, which is cool, and the moon landing, which is probably the most significant event in the whole timeline. Like that's a big moment right there for everyone, the whole world. And so even into the early 70s, there's still a lot of protests. There's a lot of movement, a lot of protesting against the war in Vietnam. And then in 1974, Richard Nixon's going to resign due to this scandal with Watergate. Yeah, getting caught, which is like part of a whole big saga of just corruption that leads back even past him. It shows that the freaking US government's been funding the war that they knew was unwinnable in Vietnam since like 1945, like since like the very end of World War II, long before they took the public.
Didn't he also declare the war on drugs?
Oh yeah.
And also on cancer.
He declared a war on cancer?
Yeah.
Oh.
Like.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the war on drugs is.
The war on drugs and the war on cancer. Like, fighting for,
Yeah.
the drugs to get the drug to get rid of cancer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Both.
Yeah, his resigning is like definitely a watershed moment for America. It's like, oh shit, the president really is a crook. Like he is totally corrupt. And then in 1979 is the Iranian embassy hostage situation, which is like that's another one of those. That was a really big deal. And then so then moving into like the 80s, the Macintosh, the beginning of the personal computer here. The fall of, that should say 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall, that kind of marks the end of the not just the 80s, but the Cold War, and really, really kind of the end of the analog era, maybe. Once we get into the 90s, the Gulf War, we'll see, is not only going to prove that America is this unilateral juggernaut, but also that we are super sophisticated technologically. We are not in the days of Vietnam anymore. But all things are not peaceful. You got the LA riots, Y2K happening on the millennial. Everybody thought they were going to die.
We got OJ.
I was gonna put OJ in there. I'm like, I should probably put that.
I think, was it the Menendez brothers too, or is that late? That's like 89 going into 90.
No, I thought they
Menendez
were right
brothers
around the same time. They were
really
close. I remember because I'm born in 81, so I was like, well, what was OJ, 94?
Yeah, I remember I was in middle school when that happened.
Yeah. I think 94.
90, I think 93, yeah, 94, 12, yeah.
So it was right around there, but yeah, man, I remember because there's a documentary on Netflix called LA 92. It's on the LA riots. It's fantastic. You guys should watch it.
Yeah.
It's kind of rough. It's footage from it, but I watched it on the news like every night right after.
Well, I mean, that was our life then. It was on every night.
It was every night, just for hours. You're just like.
And the teachers would discuss it when I go to class, and it was just like, sheesh.
Dude, I'll let you know something about me. My response is like a 11-year-old during the LA riots was like, I really want to light something on fire.
Yeah, no, me too.
I was just like, that's what I was thinking. Watching like footage now as an adult, I'm like, dude, I
That's
grew up in
horrible.
a crazy world. Like this stuff was on TV, the OJ Simpson, like the LA riots, the whole Rodney King thing. This is crazy. Like this was a nuts time to grow up, especially like in LA. It was very, very crazy. So, and then, you know, we'll